Again, it's a pleasure to be part of this conference this morning to share with all of you the work that my colleagues and I are doing in the area of resilience to dementia. And as Dr. Carlson said, today we're going to be speaking specifically on one of the factors that my lab studies, and that is exercise. All right, I have no conflicts of interest to disclose with regards to the contents of this presentation. So if you are anything like me, when my alarm goes off in the morning, which it does about 4:30 every day, because that is when I like to get up to go exercise, I get into one of these freak out modes. I give this note to my mother, or I park so far away, or I see a light. Shall I go into the light? You know, no matter how long, for how many years I've been doing this, you know, it is still somewhat of a challenge to get up in the morning to go exercise. And I would imagine that for many of us, we find ourselves in this same kind of space when it comes to exercise and becoming more physically active. But my hope is that by the end of this presentation, we are going to make believers out of you who would say, it is worth it, it is worth it, it is worth it. All right, so to dive then into the meat of my talk this morning, I'll begin with a little primer about Alzheimer's disease itself, which again is familiar probably to most of us on this conference, so I'll keep it brief. As probably most of us here knows, that this story of Alzheimer's disease began with the man you see on the left side and the woman you see on the right side. On the left side is Dr. Alzheimer, and on the right side is Frau Auguste Deter, whose family brought her in to see Dr. Alzheimer at about when she was about 51 years old. So the family had concerns that she had some disturbances in her thought system. She believed that things were happening that actually were not happening. And she has some challenges with her language. And also she has some memory difficulties. So Dr. Alzheimer then was a very young psychiatrist and also a neuropathologist. When the family brought Frau Auguste Deter in to see him, as was common in those days, he admitted her into what was called the asylum, so that he could monitor her to understand better what her symptoms are and what the potential causes of her cognitive and behavioral challenges were. Sadly, what was meant to be a very brief stay turned into a 5-year-long stint in the asylum, as it was called then. And Frau Auguste Deter actually did not leave the hospital alive. She passed away under the care of Dr. Alzheimer's. And because Dr. Alzheimer was also a neuropathologist, he was able to obtain access to Frau Auguste Deter's brain, which then examined under a microscope. And amongst various things that findings he made in her brain, he noticed that there was these two very telltale specific brain lesions in Frau Auguste Deter's brain. On the bottom left there is an image of an amyloid plaque, which was one of the brain lesions that Dr. Alzheimer found in the brain of Frau Auguste Deter. And these amyloid plaques form in the space between the neurons. They form in the space between the brain cells. The other type of lesions that he found, which is on the right and bottom right side, is what are called tangles, and this form within the neurons themselves. So this form inside of the brain cells. So amyloid plaques on the bottom left and tangles on the bottom right came to be known as the two defining pathological features of Alzheimer's as a disease. And so for the longest time, for many decades after that, the clinical lore and also the scientific lore was that if anyone had these lesions in their brain, they would, by that, the very nature or the very fact of having these lesions, also have cognitive impairment and dementia of the Alzheimer's type. Conversely, that to be devoid of these lesions is to be cognitively intact. In other words, the presence of these lesions was believed to always co-occur with either the presence or absence of cognitive impairment. Again, this was what was believed for the longest time, but as the decades passed by, the field began to notice that there were actually some exceptions to this. There were some other adults who, when they came to autopsy, based on the findings at autopsy, you would truly believe that these individuals must have had dementia when they were alive, because they had amyloid plaques, they had tangles, they had brain atrophy, and other types of vascular infarcts. However, when clinicians went back and reviewed the clinical profiles of these individuals, even up until the point of death, these individuals surprisingly turned out to be cognitively intact. So this slowly began to drive a wedge in this very strict co-occurrence of lesions in the brain and cognitive symptoms. Over time, the notion of resilience was then put forward to explain this mismatch, based on the finding that there are actually a substantial number of other adults who had brain pathologies that are key features of Alzheimer's, like the amyloid plaques or the tangles, but did not have symptoms. There are many ways that resilience or reserve can be described or defined, and I believe you heard a bit of that from the prior speaker, Dr. Zulsdorf. But common to all of these ways of conceptualizing resilience or reserve is this notion that our brains are able to tolerate a certain degree of insult or injury before reaching a critical threshold, at which point then the brain's function deteriorates and then cognitive impairment becomes evident. As you can imagine, this notion of resilience arises as a result of an intricate interplay between one's genes and one's environmental factors. I'm going to show you a schematic that kind of tries to illustrate what we mean by resilience. So if on this schematic, on the y-axis, we have cognitive function. So your ability to think and perform other types of thinking abilities. On the y-axis is time, or you can think of it also as aging, the passage of aging, or even because we know that age is also the biggest risk factor for acquiring the lesions in the brain that lead to dementia. Also think of that x-axis, that time axis. Think of it also as the incurring of brain pathologies. So also imagine that there are two hypothetical individuals, one of them who is low on resilience and the other who is high on resilience. The individual who is low on resilience is shown by the red line. Then lastly, also imagine that there is this hypothetical threshold below which if your cognition dips, then you become cognitively impaired. What the notion of resilience means is that that individual who, for whatever reason, is low on resilience hits that hypothetical threshold at an earlier point in time than the individual who is high on resilience. Notice that the individual who is high on resilience, if they are on the path to Alzheimer's or other types of dementia, they would eventually cross that impairment threshold. But again, they do so at a more distal point in time than the individual who is low on resilience. So what this means is that that individual who is high on resilience has an additional 5 or 10 years of intact cognition to enjoy their time with family, friends, and loved ones before they hit the impairment threshold. And obviously, what is not specified, but is also implied in this schematic is that if that person for that person who is high on resilience, if another intervening event leads to death in that period, that in that time span between the person who is high on resilience and the person who is low on resilience, then that individual who is high on resilience would have passed away being cognitively intact, because they did not live long enough to hit the point where they cross that impairment threshold. So resilience in this context does not mean that that person who is high on resilience, if they are on the Alzheimer's or dementia pathway, that they would never hit it. It just means that they hit it at a later point in time than the individual who is low on resilience. Now, I imagine that most of us here then are at this point curious and wondering, what is this thing, resilience, and how do we get it? How do we acquire this increased resilience? Based on work that has been done by a number of labs across the nation and the globe, several factors have been identified as contributing to increase in resilience. I'm not going to read all of them out because they are spelled out on this slide here. And obviously, again, as I mentioned in two prior slides, one's genetic makeup also plays a critical role in resilience. But for the purposes of today, we are focusing more on those behavioral, those environmental factors that have been shown to contribute to resilience. And again, in the interest of time and for the purposes of this talk, we are going to focus on physical activity as a key contributor to resilience. And so one might ask, why physical activity? Why should that be of interest to any of us? I would like to orient you to this very excellent study that was done about 10 years ago now, by Deborah Burns and Christine Yaffe, and published in one of the top journals in the field, where they decided to look at all the critically and very well done research on modifiable lifestyle factors that contribute to Alzheimer's, and to examine the effect that each of these have on the prevalence of Alzheimer's. And as you can see here, those the 7 factors that they identified are physical inactivity, depression, smoking, hypertension in midlife, obesity in midlife, low levels of education, and diabetes. What the dark gray line show for each of these factors is what would be shows the number of Alzheimer's cases that can be prevented if we're able to control each one of these lifestyle factors by 25%. And then the light gray bar shows the reduction in the number of Alzheimer's cases if we were able to prevent or to contain each of these lifestyle factors by 10%. And as you can see, physical activity here is the one that is shown, again, by this review of studies done across a large number of labs and across a long period of time. The physical inactivity showed to have the highest effects on AD prevalence, and conversely, that reduction in physical inactivity had the greatest effect on AD prevention. What they did not address in their study, but I would like to also orient you to this morning, is that when you consider the fact that physical activity also has an effect on depression, also have an effect on smoking, also has an effect on hypertension, obesity, and diabetes. When you consider all of that together, it leads us to realize that actually the potential favorable effect of physical activity on AD prevention is even more enormous than is previously understood. So before we go further, then I would like to clarify a few terms because, I'm sure that sometimes you hear these terms and you're not entirely sure what they mean. So physical activity, basically it refers to any bodily movement that results in the expenditure of energy. So when you walk from your living room to your bedroom, or you take your dog out on a walk, or you plant flowers, or you go grocery shopping, all of those things are physical activity. Exercise then is a tolerated subset of physical activity. And what distinguishes exercise from other types of physical activity are four key terms. The first is that exercise is planned. Secondly, it's structured. Thirdly, it's repetitive. And fourthly, it's intentional. So this is what distinguishes exercise from any other type of bodily movement called physical activity. Lastly, then, cardiorespiratory fitness refers to the capacity of your heart, your lung, your muscles, and your bones to support sustained work. Fitness is mostly measured or quantified by what is called VO2 peak, which stands for the volume of oxygen consumed in the performance of work. Think about it this way. Any physical activity or exercise that does not result in an increase in VO2 peak does not have much of a chance of impacting brain health, cognitive health, or even overall health. So VO2 peak or aerobic fitness is the final common pathway through which physical activity or exercise has any positive effect on the brain or cognition, or again, overall health. So what I intend to do in the rest of the time that we have here is to share some of the work that my colleagues around the nation and also my lab has done around the topics of physical activity, aerobic fitness, and exercise. And I will begin with physical activity. The first study I want to share with you here is this study done by the Rush group. You heard a lot about the Rush group from Dr. Zursdorf's talk. They are at the forefront of research in Alzheimer's prevention and Alzheimer's cure. So this study that is now a few years old, they quantified physical activity using trackers to track how much physical activity individuals got every day. And then they followed these other adults up until when they passed away, because this was a long-running study. The red line are those who had a high amount of physical activity. The black line are those who had a low amount of physical activity. On the y-axis indicates risk for Alzheimer's up until the point of death. As you can see, the black line, which is those who had low levels of physical activity, the black line increased sharply from time point 0 to year 5 in the study, which indicates that those individuals who did not engage in a lot of physical activity were across time at an increased risk of being diagnosed with AD and having other types of cognitive impairment compared to those who engaged in a high amount of physical activity shown in the red line. So then now I'm going to share some work that my own lab has done in this area. And for this work, we wanted to ask a fundamental question. As I mentioned earlier, as most of us also here know, age is the biggest risk factor for Alzheimer's, and not only for the diagnosis of the dementia of Alzheimer's type, but also for beginning to accumulate some of those brain changes that then puts one at risk for Alzheimer's. So the main question that we wanted to answer in this, to address in this study, was to find out to the extent to which physical activity attenuates this well-established negative impact of age on these key markers for Alzheimer's, including amyloid, including glucose uptake, hippocampal volume, and episodic memory. And I will just dive right into the results in the interest of time. So here we're looking at the results from amyloid burden. Now at the top here, you see two brain scans. This represents a brain that has low amounts of amyloid in it, and this represents a brain that has high amounts of amyloid in it. So here, red, the scan being red indicates that there is a lot of amyloid in the brain. Coming down here then, the red line indicates the individuals who had low amounts of physical activity. So individuals who did not meet the American Heart Association guidelines for 30 minutes or more of moderate intensity physical exercise for 5 days a week. So you see that for those individuals who did not meet this threshold for being physically active, with the passage of time, that is age, those individuals had an increasing amount of amyloid being detected in their brain. That is, their brain in principle went from looking like this to looking like this. And again, this is what ordinarily one might expect just with the passage of age or time itself. However, when you look at those who are physically active, even though it might appear that they started off with a higher amount of amyloid in the brain, that level stayed stable across time. So in essence, it did not matter if this individual was 75 or 55 or 45, the amount of amyloid in their brain did not increase. In other words, in principle, their brain stayed in this state despite the passage of time. So what this indicates is that in the case of amyloid, the physical activity was able to attenuate the already well-established, and again, as seen here, it was able to attenuate this strong link between age and amyloid. What about the other markers we looked at? The next one here being glucose uptake. Glucose uptake is an important marker to look at because glucose is the key fuel that our brain cells need to function and to do their job right. And so over here at the top again, just to orient you, this is how a healthy brain looks like when you put it through a glucose PET scan. You see a lot of red, which means that the neurons are well, they are alive, and they are functioning as they should. Whereas, for a brain that is not in its normal state, this is what it looks like. So in this case, red is actually a good thing. What we then see again, the red line indicates again those who were physically inactive. And what you see again is that with the passage of time, going from 45 to 75, those individuals who were physically inactive experience a decrease, a very sharp decrease in the rate of glucose uptake in the brain, which again is what one might expect just as a consequence of aging itself. However, when you look at those who are physically active, that is the black line, you see that across ages from 45 to 75, they maintain a very robust and healthy level of glucose uptake. In other words, for the individuals who are physically active, their brains remain in this state and did not transition from this state to this state despite getting older in age. The same was also found when we look at other key measures. So here now we're looking at the volume of the hippocampus, which is a key center for learning and memory in the brain, as well as performance on key memory tests. Once again, in summary, we see that when you look at the red line, that is those who are physically inactive, you see that as time passes, they experience a decrement in both the volumes of the hippocampus and their performance on memory test scores. Whereas those who are physically active, we do not see a similar rate of decrease in the levels of both brain volume and cognitive test performance. So taken together then, what these findings indicate is that a physically active lifestyle has the potential to slow down and maybe even stabilize the rate at which our brains undergo changes that are typical for Alzheimer's. Physical activity also slows the rate at which our ability to perform memory tests, to learn and remember things, changes with age. Now I'm going to switch gears a little bit now and talk about cardiorespiratory fitness next. And I'll begin by describing this study that was done by colleagues at Northwestern University. So this study, they wanted to do this to look at the extent to which fitness might reduce brain tissue loss that occurs as a function of aging. Again, as you've heard me now say a few times, age is the biggest risk factor for Alzheimer's and other type of dementia. So it makes sense that they wanted to perform this study to examine to the extent to which to which aerobic fitness might reduce the rate of brain tissue loss. So what you see on the left panel here is the result of the experiment to examine where in the brain does aging have its effect. And the answer is pretty much everywhere. That as people age, there is a loss of brain tissue pretty much across most areas of the brain. And some of these areas are areas that are heavily impacted by Alzheimer's. So at the bottom here is where your hippocampus lives, over here, and that is susceptible to the effects of aging. There is also the frontal and regions here that are also known to be involved in Alzheimer's, and then the parietal lobe here, and areas called the posterior cingulates, which again are involved in Alzheimer's. All of these areas undergo changes as a result of aging itself. The next thing then that the authors did was then to ask, okay, what happens to all of these changes when we then control or adjust for the amount of aerobic fitness? Again, in this case was measured by VO2 peak. What happens to this well-established effect of aging when we also adjust or control for the fact that the individuals in this study had a varying degree of aerobic fitness? And this is what they found, is this, that pretty much that most of those changes that they had seen as a consequence of aging disappeared, particularly in these areas I mentioned that are very much involved in Alzheimer's, the posterior cingulate, the precuneus, and then the effect in the hippocampus was no longer there. So what am I saying? The negative effect of aging on the brain was diminished by aerobic fitness. This was a great finding, and it was very encouraging because it was one of the first ones to demonstrate that as much as many of us worry about aging and things that occur as a result of aging, there actually is a lifestyle factor that is able to slow and even completely eradicate some of the well-known changes that one might expect as a result of aging, and that is aerobic fitness. So then to follow this up, a few years back, my lab decided to design a study to furthermore examine the effect of fitness on some of the key markers for Alzheimer's. What you see here is a picture of an elderly man doing a graded exercise test. This is the way we measure VO2 peak, and some of you might even have been involved in this study I'm describing here. But basically, the graded exercise test, how this works is that we put you on a treadmill, we hook you up to this contraption to your face, which we connect to some pieces of equipment, and then we have you speed walk or lightly run on a treadmill as we increase both the incline and the speed of the treadmill. And we have to keep going until you pretty much cannot go anymore, and then we stop. And then at that point, we are able to quantify what is the highest volume of oxygen consumed in the performance of this work. And that is your VO2 peak. So the question then that we wanted to answer in this study is that, does higher aerobic fitness modify the effect of ApoE4 on the CSF markers for Alzheimer's? So just a few words here to put this in context. I have now mentioned a few times that age is the biggest risk factor for Alzheimer's, and that is true. The second biggest risk factor for Alzheimer is the ApoE4 allele. When an individual carries one or more copies of the ApoE4 allele, it puts them at a substantially increased risk for developing Alzheimer's over time. And one of the well-established pathways through which ApoE influences risk for Alzheimer is that it disturbs the processing of amyloid in the system. So basically in this study then we're asking one question, two. First is, does ApoE show its well-known effect on amyloid in our cohort? And then secondly, does fitness modify that well-established effect of amyloid in our cohorts? And to cut to the chase, here are the results in summary form. So first of all, just to orient you, as you can see here, the blue bar are those who are ApoE4 negative. The red bar are those who are ApoE4 positive. We also split the sample up, as you can imagine, into those who had low VO2 peak, that is those who have low fitness, and those who have high VO2 peak, those who have high fitness. Among those who have low VO2 peak, we see exactly what we expect, that when you are ApoE4 positive, you have a reduction in the levels of amyloid in your CSF. So again, to put this in context, for those of us who are not familiar with this line of work, amyloid in the CSF, low amyloid in the CSF puts one at risk for developing Alzheimer's. The converse or the reverse is true in the brain. High amyloid in the brain puts you at risk for developing Alzheimer's. So just to be clear that here we're looking at amyloid in the CSF. And again, when amyloid in the CSF is low, it puts an individual at risk for developing Alzheimer's. So what we are seeing here is that among those who are not fit, we see what we expect in that ApoE4, being ApoE4 positive, puts you at risk of having reduced amyloid and further along on the pathway to Alzheimer's. Again, this is what we would expect. However, when we look at those who are fit, those who have high VO2 peak, the story was different. And it's this, that among those who have high aerobic fitness, pretty much it does not matter whether you are ApoE4 positive or ApoE4 negative. You are not at any more risk of developing Alzheimer's based on your ApoE4 carriership. And this was the first time that we are aware of that any study was able to demonstrate that a lifestyle factor such as aerobic fitness pretty much attenuates, wipes out the effect of your DNA, the effect of your genetic makeup on your risk for Alzheimer's. And this was very encouraging news because this had not been shown prior to this time. So here is where we are so far. We have presented evidence to indicate that a physically active lifestyle might lead to the prevention or slowing down of Alzheimer's. It can do this by attenuating, by decreasing the influence of aging on the brain and cognition. It can also do this by altering the effect of your gene on the key markers for Alzheimer's. And these are all very encouraging news, because this is where the field wants to move to understand how we can change for individuals the trajectory that takes them from being cognitively intact to having dementia, particularly of the Alzheimer's type. That said, a few years ago, the National Institute on Aging convened a panel of experts to survey what is known up until then about modifiable risk factors for Alzheimer's. And what they said at the end was that firm conclusions cannot be drawn about the association between any modifiable risk factor with Alzheimer's. In other words, we see that there seems to be a linkage between engaging in some of these positive lifestyle factors and having a lower risk of Alzheimer's. However, that does not indicate that there is a causal connection, that doing any of this, that engaging in any of these positive lifestyle factors would, by nature of force, result in a reduction in the risk of Alzheimer's. However, they did indicate that individuals should aim to continue engaging in a physically and mentally active lifestyle. They also said that in order for us to begin to talk about causal link, that A is a cause of B, that we need to conduct more rigorous studies, otherwise called randomized clinical trials, that will enable us to test both causal links and also the mechanisms under those links. And for the last part of this talk then, I'm going to walk you quickly through one of such randomized clinical trials that were performed in my lab. So here I present you some data on the REACH study. REACH stands for the Aerobic Exercise and Cognitive Health Pilot Study. This was a study that was funded by the Alzheimer's Association. And again, I want to give a shout out to members of the association who are on this conference call this morning. So the objective of this study was to investigate the feasibility and acceptability of 6 months of aerobic exercise intervention in middle-aged adults who have a family history of AD. Prior to this point in time, no study had actually looked at whether other adults who have a family history of AD, and again, being in midlife also means that they might still be caring for their parent or parents who have AD, and also trying to work to maintain a living and also run and manage their own families. So these individuals have a lot on their plate. And therefore, it is unknown if it's even possible to recruit them, retain them, and engage them in 6 months of aerobic exercise training. That was what this study set out to try to investigate. And then also to take an initial look on the effect of this intervention on glucose uptake and cognition, and also take a little poke at some of the biological mechanisms by which this intervention might have its effect. For the purposes of this talk, I'm just going to focus on some of the key findings in the area of glucose uptake and cognition. To be eligible for this study, there were just three key things that individuals were supposed to meet. The first is that they had to have a family history of Alzheimer's, obviously. Then they also had to currently, at that time, be physically inactive. And lastly, to have the permission or consent of their physician to engage in physical activity. And so after we enrolled them, we split them up by a random process into two groups: the usual physical activity group and the enhanced physical activity group. All right. So this is a kind of a schematic of what the typical workout plan looked like for individuals in these two groups across weeks 1 to 26 of this study. So what you see here is that, at between weeks 1 and 4, the individuals in the usual and physical activity group worked out at less than 50% of their heart rate reserve, whereas those in the enhanced physical activity group engaged in a workout that kept them at between 50 to 60% of their heart rate reserve for 20 to 35 minutes every day for 3 days a week. And as time went on from the 5th week to the 26th week, those in the usual and physical activity group, we assume that again, they continued doing what they were doing before they entered the study, which basically was being physically inactive. Whereas for those in the enhanced physical activity group, we were able to titrate them up to more challenging levels of physical activity, up until the point where they're working out at 70 to 80% of their heart rate reserve for almost an hour each time for 3 days a week. So this is what the regimen looked like for members of both groups. All right, then here is the first study the first result I wanted to share with you. You might remember me saying a few slides back that VO2 peak is the measure of aerobic fitness, and that any physical activity or exercise that does not result in a change, in an increase in aerobic fitness, does not have a chance of positively impacting your brain health or cognition. Therefore, then it made sense that the first thing we wanted to do was to find out whether this intervention actually led to an increase in VO2 peak over the 26 weeks, and the answer was yes. That the individuals who are in the enhanced condition saw a sizable increase in the VO2 peak from weeks 0 to 26, whereas those who are in the usual physical activity group did not experience a similar rate of increase in the aerobic fitness. The next thing then is to look at change in brain function, in this case anchored with brain glucose metabolism. At the top here is an average scan from an individual who is in the usual physical activity group, and at the bottom here is an average scan from those who are in the enhanced physical activity group. If you may remember, I had said that for glucose metabolism, the color red on the scan is a good thing, because the color red means that the neurons are well, the neurons are alive, and the neurons are functioning as they should to support thinking abilities. So what you can see here is that, again, particularly in this area of the brain that I mentioned is very much involved in Alzheimer's, like the posterior cingulate and the precuneus, that those in the enhanced physical, in the enhanced activity group have a bigger change from baseline to 26 week. They had a much bigger change in the rate of glucose metabolism in this Alzheimer involved parts of the brain compared to those in the usual physical activity group. What this suggests is that engagement in 6 months of moderate intensity physical activity is able to positively impact the brain of individuals who had not done any physical activity or much physical activity up until that point in their life, up until when they were in their 50s, 60s, or 70s. They are still able to experience a positive change in brain health as a result of adopting a new physical activity regimen. The next question then that we asked is, okay, we saw on the prior slide that there was an increase in aerobic fitness in those who are in the enhanced physical activity group. Now we are seeing that there also is a positive increase in the rate of glucose uptake. But do those two things go hand in hand? And the answer is actually true. It's yes, they do. So what we show here is a plot that correlates brain glucose uptake on the y-axis here and then change in aerobic fitness on the x-axis. And we see that the association here is a positive one, which means that on average, the more change you experience in your levels of aerobic fitness from the beginning to the end of the study, also the more change, the more increase you saw in the rate of brain glucose uptake from the beginning to the end of the study. This leads us to believe that the change that we saw in the brain in terms of brain glucose metabolism was undergirded by the change in aerobic fitness. Next, then we wanted to look at what happens when we look at cognition. So here we had administered 3 cognitive tests to the participants at the beginning of the study and also at the end of the 26 weeks. These first 2 tests are tests of memory. The CVLT total and the CVLT long delay are measures of learning and recall of a long list. The DKEP's color word interference task is a measure of executive function, which I'm sure that some of us here have heard, as the ability to multitask, the ability to hold something in memory while doing something else. So again, to orient you, for the CVLT, so for these two tests, higher scores are better. Whereas because the DKEP's test is a time test, lower scores are better. So what we see here is that among those in the enhanced physical activity group, there is an increase in the CVLT from baseline to follow-up, and also an improved performance here seen by a lower score for the DKEP's color word interference task. And that was not seen in the usual physical activity group. And then we also see that there is an association between the change in VO2 peak and the change in performance on the DKEP's color word interference task, leading us to conclude that aerobic fitness is what drove this change in cognition in this study. To conclude then, the data that we've looked at indicates that yes, AD poses and continues to pose a public health crisis for all of us. And because there remains and there continues to be a lack of disease modifying agents, there is a critical need for alternative approaches for containing or halting this global crisis. And the data from my lab and labs across the country leads us to believe that the secret to halting this crisis might lie in exercise. Now, some take-home points then. The first is, as I mentioned, the individuals in the REACH study were people who were in their 50s, 60s, or 70s who had not had much of an experience with exercise in their life. Yet, when they began this study and stayed with it for only 6 months, they show an appreciable and favorable change in brain and cognitive health. Therefore, it is never too late to begin. That said, it will always be important for you to check with your physician before you begin any new exercise regimen, just to make sure that you are starting safely and performing at levels that does not put you at risk for injury or harm. And when you begin any new exercise and regimen, it's going to be important to start small and then add on. And you could add on by either increasing the frequency, that is the number of days per week, or increasing the intensity, how hard you are working, or the duration. It could even be simple things like choosing to sit less and stand more, and parking further away when you go grocery and shopping, taking these stairs when possible, and then like taking small walks around your apartment or house when talking on the phone. These are all little things, but then they add up in aggregates. And also, it's going to be important to mention that even though we have focused in this talk on aerobic type of exercises or physical activity, it is important to realize that variety is the key. You want to mix in both aerobic, strength, and balancing type exercises. And last but not least, it is going to be important that to achieve success in this domain, it's important to persist. To persist, and even when it feels like you're not seeing the effects or the results, or that it is difficult, you want to persist. And then on that note, I want to leave you with this website. It is the NIA website for physical activity in older adults. It has lots of helpful tips. You can even get an online coach to help you begin and continue a regimen of physical activity. I want to end by thanking those who provided funding for this study, thanking the staff and participants of both the Wisconsin Registry for Alzheimer's Prevention and the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, without whom none of this is possible. I also want to acknowledge the numerous collaborators who have helped make all of this possible. And lastly, even though I'm the one who is presenting this work, really, I didn't do most of this work. My lab did, my students and staff and trainees did, and I give them all the credits. When I started this talk, I said that my hope was that by the end of this talk, we're going to move you from being a non-believer to a believer in exercise. And I hope that we were able to accomplish that at this point in the talk. So thank you for your attention.